This is Mara and Ben for StellarStrategyGaming. Today we're doing something a little bit different. We came across the famous or infamous trailer for the new Netflix show Q-Force, which is apparently about a group of secret agents or superheroes. It's not quite clear, honestly. And all of them are LGBTQ. They seem to all be gay men, although I didn't watch that closely to sort out who was what. It's a touch indelicate, to put it more delicately than it deserves, and Mara particularly wanted to do this video. Of the two of us, one is a member of the LGBTQ plus community, one is not. Internet, I'll leave it to you to figure it out. Now, Mara, tell us what your thoughts on this trailer are.
Yes, well, my thoughts just looking at this, and the first red flag you'll come across is just the placeholder card that YouTube does for its videos, and you can see, I think, all 5 main characters, and every single one of them is how you'd imagine a cartoon depicting a character coded as gay from 40 years ago, I'd say, or maybe not 40 years ago, but you get what I mean, the early days of Disney where they were just objectively terrible with any kind of representation. That's what we're seeing here, and indeed the trailer really does continue that, as if you watch this trailer, not only is it nothing like what it looks like, it's not kid-friendly in any way, despite the style and appearance looking kid-friendly, so just don't buy into that. And as it goes on, every single character here is the most stereotypical LGBTQ character I can imagine. And I'm not talking about a stereotype in the way that Darth Vader is a stereotype for a villain or anything like that, where they're either a trendsetter or they just did it really well and did something new with the stereotype. These are just the most generic, bland, and frankly offensive stereotypes that anyone can have about the LGBTQ community. Other friends I know who are far more into LGBTQ culture were actually more offended than I was, which is really saying something. And just continuing to watch this, I won't get into any of the jokes or anything because frankly I think they'd get us demonetized pretty quickly. I will say that the entire thing struck me as though it was being written by someone who was maybe 60 or 70 and really thought they were hip and cool with all the gay kids, and ended up trying, maybe out of a good intention, I don't know, but ended up trying to represent the LGBTQ community, and did it so badly that it became offensive again. It's downright homophobic.
And what this reminds me of is back in the, I guess it was late 80s, early 90s, there was a television show called Married with Children. It was a comedy, and LGBTQ plus issues actually came up a few times in the show. I remember a particular episode with a gay character, and I remember an episode with a transgender character. It might have been the first time I saw a transgender person represented on television. And at the time, they were mostly presented as sort of a punchline, but the characters were allowed to sort of exist in that world. They weren't physically attacked for being what they were, and the jokes were kind of one and done. It wasn't the whole episode wasn't about making fun of these characters. So for the time, it was very progressive. Now, looking back on it decades later, it's not. It's important to remember what is progressive and new at one time isn't progressive and new for another. Mel Brooks movies were extremely progressive back in the 70s, early 80s. And, now don't get me wrong, they're hilarious. Go watch all of them. But they're pretty cringe-inducing now. And it's important to understand that for example, the terms you would use to describe a black person, what was standard 100 years ago is offensive now. So just having LGBTQ plus people represented isn't progressive anymore. The fact that you have a gay character, that doesn't mean much. And one of the things that I got from just watching the trailer of this is that every joke, every commentary, everything somehow directly related to something directly sexual and to the character's sexuality. I have had long and involved conversations with gay people where the topic of sex didn't come up, where the topic of them being gay did not come up, where I wouldn't necessarily have known anything about their sexuality. In the same way that not every straight man walks around with exactly 2 days of stubble doing a steely-eyed stare into the sunset and talking about how much he wants to sex every attractive woman who walks by. It's an offense. Like, as I'm saying that, there are plenty of keyboard warriors who would immediately be typing, "Oh, no, I'm not like that. I respect women. I'm friends with." Yeah, exactly. That's the point. And there are plenty of gay dudes who are just like out there living most of the time, and their sexuality is part of their life, but it's not the whole of who they are as people.
Yeah, and indeed you actually touch on something which is basically writing 101. I've written a few short stories myself and done some concepting for other people, and the first rule about writing a character with a different gender identity, or if they're an alien species, different species, or a different race if they're human, is never to make that their personality. It tends to be a facet of a personality, perhaps, and there are definitely cultural influences. Again, LGBTQ culture is very much a thing, and even for people who aren't very in-depth with it, it still tends to play at least a small role, especially in how they are perceived and how they go about perceiving the world a bit. So you definitely want to have a character have perhaps a little bit of personality around them being gay, bisexual, trans, whatever it is. But again, that should never be their entire personality. That just isn't good. It's a trope. It's not meant to happen in a natural person.
You're exactly right, and the result of that is that, at least based on this trailer, obviously we haven't seen the show yet. I might decide to watch it over copious amounts of alcohol to get through it. Probably not, if I'm honest. Point is, though, when you make the whole thing about the person's gender identity, their sexuality, or whatever it is, anything about them, it can be one of two things. It can be a very insightful, in-depth dive into that thing. I remember seeing a long time ago an Israeli film called Ushpizin, which means visitors, and it was about a Hasidic Jewish couple around the time of a holiday called Sukkot. And it was just this really interesting, in-depth dive into everything about that holiday and that culture and who they were as people. And regardless of what you think about Israel or Hasidic Jews or whatever, it was interesting. There's none of that happening here. The second option is that it becomes a parody of people, and parody can be tasteful, but this doesn't look tasteful. There's a scene where the most masculine of the gay dudes kicks in a door and shouts something about, we're here to catch you, and it's an empty room, and he says something about all that masculinity wasted, and the other one goes, "Not entirely wasted, my little butthole went boop." Like, there's nothing tasteful happening in that scene.
Yes, and on top of that, I mean, aside from how obnoxious that is, to the point where that really threw me off a little bit just to hear it again, on top of all of that, if you're going to make it that central to everything, it needs to be, as you say, in an insightful fashion. A good example of this was Legends of Tomorrow, which we were actually discussing after watching this, where at least 2 crew members are somewhere on the LGBTQ spectrum. I won't speculate as to how many more are, but 2 crew members are definitely confirmed to be on the LGBTQ spectrum. And those 2 characters are some of the best. They can do everything all the other characters do, which is very important, again, to remain respectful. And while their sexuality comes into play and can occasionally be a plotline, I think the captain of the show ends up sleeping with the Queen of France on a mission one time. It's not dominating the scene, And to reference that just truly horrific joke one more time, why does kicking down a door have to be a masculine thing? There are plenty of people who identify as women who I know who would actually be more likely to kick down a door than a man, and they are completely straight and all of that. So it's just like, okay, this just doesn't work. It's not reflective of anything about modern society.
In complete fairness, like if the guy had done that and made that line, that is actually the kind of campy thing that some gay guys I have known would say in that situation, or it seems like they would. I've yet to be in a situation where a gay dude kicked down a door and made a heroic declaration, so I can't say with 100% certainty. There's some speculation here. The way the character responded was just so tasteless. If it was just something like, that was hot or something like that, like that would have been at least somewhat tasteful, somewhat respectful. And there was none of that going on. A more perhaps well-known example of a character's sexuality not having to dominate the story, in the first Wonder Woman movie with Gal Gadot starring in it, there is a scene where she has a conversation with Chris Pine's character about sex and sexuality, and she doesn't come out and say it directly, but there's a strong implication, which makes entirely sense, that the women of that island have lesbian relationships with each other. And then the story just goes on. And then she hooks up with Chris Pine's character later on, because, he's dreamy. I don't care how straight of a dude or lesbian of a woman you are, that guy's dreamy. But then the story just goes on. Like, it doesn't, it's not the whole entire story. It's getting to be close to time to wrap it up. I'm going to kick it to Mara in a moment for Mara's final thoughts. Something I wanted to address, though, because it really bothered me in the trailer, was there was a point where one of the characters says, "You guys are acting like Citibank at Pride," which is referencing sort of an over-the-top display of support for the LGBTQ plus community that is not sincere and is clearly not sincere. And whoever wrote this was probably thinking, this is a great self-referential inside joke kind of thing, where we are acknowledging that maybe we're not doing this the best. That can work in the right circumstances, but what this put me in mind of was the scene in Avengers Age of Ultron, where Hawkeye goes on his whole speech to the Scarlet Witch about none of this makes any sense, the city is flying, we're being attacked by robots, and I have a bow and arrow. Pointing out how bad your content is doesn't make your content better. Those kinds of self-referential in-jokes are only good if the content is already good. It's a win more situation. It doesn't salvage a bad piece of creative work.
Yes, and so my final thoughts are actually not directed at the show itself, but instead the creators, one of which is Sean Hayes, who is the problem child of this film, and the other of which has made some pretty good stuff, and I don't think he's in full creative control, so I'm not going to address him here. Sean Hayes, though, after the criticism that the trailer got, because oh boy did the internet blow up over this thing, obviously, but he said, and I quote, "Well, it's meant to represent the stereotypes that even people within the LGBTQ community have," which again, I take issue with, because he is a straight white male who is over 50. But on top of that, it's just such a problem for him to think that he can do this. Not only does he not have the authority to speak on it, but it's effectively calling his audience idiots, because he's assuming that people don't know enough about the LGBTQ community to say, no, that's wrong. It's a bit like when M. Night Shyamalan claimed that the reason why Avatar: The Last Airbender got so much hate was because no one was smart enough to understand it. It's just like, cool it down, man. And it's very clear that Netflix just didn't really choose the best people here to make this, which is disappointing, because we know they can do better. Shows like Kipo and things like that have great LGBTQ characters with lots of depth, and we're just not getting at here. And that's the most disappointing thing of all, is the fact that we know Netflix can make great shows focused on LGBTQ characters, and we're just not getting that.
As always, we thank you very much for watching and listening. This is a bit of a deviation from our usual content. Leave us a comment below. Tell us what you think about this trailer. Tell us what you think about these kinds of issues. Tell us if you'd like to see more of this kind of stuff from us. We're a young, small channel, so, we're happy to give you what you want within reason. And as always, we thank you for watching. Like and subscribe and for more. For the moment, we'll be back to regularly scheduled D&D content shortly.